If you got the chance to tell the future, but that came with always having to tell the truth, would you accept it? Would you be able to do it? And would you be able to live with the consequences? Back in the 13th century, this choice was given to one young man, and he became Scotland's greatest prophet. His name was Thomas, but he became known as True Thomas or Thomas the Rhymer. This is a very strange tale indeed about how Thomas came into his powers. Thomas was born about 1220 AD and lived in Ercildown in Berwickshire. He lived very close to a grove of trees which were on the banks of the Huntley Burn. Thomas was a writer and a poet and loved to lie under one special tree. Thomas loved music and he played the lute. It helped him find inspiration for his work. One day, as Thomas lazed under his favourite tree, just listening to the birds sing, he saw a beautiful lady approaching him on a horse that was dappled grey. The lady came closer to Thomas. He noticed strange things about the horse and the woman. He saw that the clothes she wore were nothing like the ladies he knew were wearing. The dress she wore was green silk and velvet, and on the locks of her horse's mane hung 59 silver bells. Her saddle looked like pure ivory set with different precious stones, and the bridle, well, that was pure gold. A horn hung around her neck, and in her belt was a sheath of arrows. Thomas bowed to the beautiful lady. He said she must be the Queen of Heaven, as he had never seen anything more beautiful walking the earth. She replied that she was not the Queen of Heaven, but the Queen of Elfland. Thomas was totally taken with her beauty, and he made a rash decision to kiss her underneath his favourite tree, even though she warned him that, should he kiss her, he would then be in her power. Thomas had been warned, and when they kissed, before his eyes she became an extremely old lady. Her beauty vanished and her clothes turned to rags. She told him that he must serve her for 7 years, through wealth and woe. The Elf Queen mounted her horse and commanded Thomas to mount behind her. Thomas was forced to obey the command. They rode towards the Eildon Hills, and to the amazement of Thomas it opened up before them, and they entered the caverns of the earth. At such speed did the horses race, it seemed they were going faster than the wind. The ride went on for many days and nights, and they rode in only darkness. There was no sun or moon, just the roaring of the sea. At times they went through streams of red blood, for all the blood that was spilt on earth went through the streams of the country through which they were travelling. Eventually they came to the most beautiful garden full of fruit trees. Thomas was starving and needed something to eat, but the Queen warned him not to touch it, for it was cursed. If he ate the fruit, she said, his soul would go to hell. The Elf Queen gave him some bread and some wine. While they rested, she told Thomas, "Lay the head down on my knee," and she would show him 3 wonderful visions. The first vision was of a difficult, narrow road lined with thorns and briars. That, she said, was the path of goodness, which leads to the city of God, a path which few take. Then she showed him a broad road where roses and lilies bloomed by the wayside. That, she said, was the easy path of wickedness, though some thought it the path to heaven. Then she showed him a fair green road that twisted between wooded rocky glades. Small falls of water ran down the rocks and glistened in the sunlight. That, she said, was the road to the fairylands where they were going that very night. They set off riding again, eventually came across a lovely castle standing high on a hill. Before they entered, the Elf Queen warned him that her lord was served by many knights. He would not be pleased that Thomas had been bold enough to kiss his lady. He must not speak, and must only respond to the Elf Queen herself. If he did not do this, she said, he would never return to his own country. Suddenly, the Queen once more shone with beauty. Her clothes became as green as the leaves of spring, and her velvet cloak hung around her shoulders. Thomas's clothes also changed. He now wore a suit made of beautiful soft cloth, and on his feet were a pair of green velvet shoes. The lady raised her horn and blew a note so clear and loud, and rode towards the castle gate. All the court knelt low before the Queen. Thomas followed her at her side, and the knights crowded around to ask him tales of his own land, but Thomas, being clever, stayed silent. When Thomas and the Queen entered the great hall, it was full of feasting and fun. Members of the elf court danced happily to the wild music of the harps and the lutes. For 7 years Thomas served the elf queen in that strange and magic land. The time passed as if he was only there, in a dream. Thomas thought that only 3 days had passed when the elf queen came to him and told him he must leave. The time had come round, she said, when the court had to pay tribute to hell. An evil spirit would come and claim their most favoured guest. Thomas was likely to be chosen, so she must take him back to his world. The elf queen brought him again to the border of our world, and sadly he left the fairy kingdom. Before he left, the elf queen pulled an apple from a tree and gave it to Thomas. "This is your wages," she said, "for it will give you a tongue that can never lie." Thomas said that this was a gift that he didn't want or need, but the queen insisted. Then she told him to choose between becoming a great harper or a great prophet. He chose the skill of prophecy. Before the Queen took her leave, she showed some of the future to Thomas. She promised they would meet again in the future when she sent 2 messengers to fetch him. With that, the Queen left. Thomas then fell asleep and awoke where he had first met the Queen. Thomas returned to the upper world with the gift of prophecy and a tongue that could never lie. 7 long years had passed since Thomas had been home, and the villagers stared with an open mouth as they saw him once again. Where had he been? What had happened? Thomas used the gifts the Queen had given him to see into the future and to tell of many events that would be important for Scotland. He became very famous, and people said his skills were as great as those of the famous magician Merlin. Thomas made his predictions in the form of songs or rhymes and became known as Thomas the Rhymer. Thomas became famous throughout Scotland, and he became a rich man. He built a great tower in Ercildown, and each year he held a banquet for the villagers. Many years passed, and Thomas still missed the Elf Queen and the Elf Land. One day, during the banquet, news came that in the village there walked side by side a hart and hind, each as white as newly fallen snow, unafraid of the crowd that had gathered to watch. It was then that Thomas made his final prophecy. He said, "My sand is run, my thread is spun, those messengers are for me." He set out towards the tree under which he had first met the Elf Queen. He was never seen again. Thomas, they say, returned to the fairy kingdom. Today, by the banks of the river Leader, the ruins of an old tower can be seen, thought to be the home of the ancient prophet. Although Thomas has long gone, his prophecies remain. Thomas predicted many things: the death of Alexander III, that Robert the Bruce would become the King of Scotland, the Scots' defeat at the Battle of Flodden, and the defeat of Mary, Queen of Scots, forces in 1567. Thomas's prophecies were so respected that they were even consulted before the Jacobite uprisings in 1715 and 1745. Like many prophets, he also foretold the end of the world. When the cows of Gowrie come to land, the judgment day is near at hand. The cows of Gowrie are 2 islands off Invergowrie that are rumoured to approach the land at 1 inch per year. So I wouldn't think the end of the world is near just yet. However, we may not have heard the last of Thomas, for local legend says that he lives in the hollows of Eildon Hills, and one day, like Merlin, he will return to help Scotland in her hour of greatest need.